Thank you, David. Premier Brumby, Minister Garrett, Auntie Doreen, Sir Gus, colleagues, I'd like to start with two thank yous. The first to the Wurundjeri people for that very nice welcome we had, but also to Mark Stone and his wonderful team. I've been working internationally for 20-odd years in Asia, Africa, Latin America and Europe, and it's always nice to have an invitation to come back home. I'm going to talk about two events that happened in the 19th century and hopefully link them into this Congress. 150 years ago, in a seemingly insignificant event in rural USA, it's something that sparked a change that was so great that it transformed our societies, our economies, and the natural world that we live in. And that event was in a small field in Pennsylvania. In 1859, the Drake Well was the first successful exploitation of oil from geological structures. Premier Brumby, I do know that in 1859 also there was another big event, and that was the year that Melbourne first published the laws of Aussie rules. But the Drake Well, it triggered an international search for oil. This led to the development of an abundant and cheap energy source, such that today 80 to 90% of the world's energy needs are met by fossil fuels. 70% of that comes from oil and gas. Our ability to tap into this wonderful energy of oil and gas enabled amazing changes in all aspects of society and economics. Cheap, reliable, abundant energy supported the development of astounding technologies. It enabled us to build and live in vast cities, to produce staggering amounts of food, fibre and materials, and to transport these cheaply and quickly over vast distances. All of us here today, we've benefited in some way or another by the energy revolution, and that has catapulted us into a modern age. Yet these benefits haven't been distributed equally. Around about 1.4 billion people still live in poverty. More than that, 1.6 billion don't have access to electricity. In Africa alone, 75% of the population remains without access to power. The energy revolution that allowed our societies and economies to flourish has also been the driving factor for production and consumption patterns that exceed the capacity of the world to handle. They've enabled us to dam most of our rivers, to clear most of our forests, and to strip the seas of species after species of fish in search of protein. The organisation I work for, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, produces the Red List of Threatened Species. For the medical professionals in this room, it's somewhat like taking the blood pressure of nature, and it tells us we're not healthy. 12% of birds, 23% of mammals, and a rather astounding 31% of amphibians are globally threatened with extinction. In 2005, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment concluded that 60% of the world's ecosystems have been degraded. I'm sure for those doctors in the room, if you had to tell one of your patients 60% of your body function is degraded, you'd put them straight into hospital. The unsustainable practices of the world's economies, both in developed and the developing world, are driving our natural systems to an ecological tipping point that we all know will have devastating consequences in future generations. If all of that wasn't depressing enough, we've belatedly come to realise that fossil fuels that we owe so much of our development and wealth to are also the primary cause of climate change. The natural carbon cycle is being overwhelmed by increasing concentrations of greenhouse gases. This compounds other biodiversity loss. As we lose the natural capital from which our societies and economies are based, we also face a bit of a paradox. In the face of ecological decline, the living standards of the average citizen in the developed world has got better and better. The economic, social and cultural signals that we receive through the media on a daily basis are often disconnected from the fact that we depend on nature. I would guess that one possible reason for this, particularly in the developed world, is that we've insulated ourselves from nature. And we've insulated ourselves to an extent from the consequences of our consumption patterns. Most of us live in cities. We've got very limited contact with nature. Our supermarkets are stocked with goods, and we get all sorts of services that we only have the vaguest notion of where they come from, how they're produced. In the developing world, people often have a much better idea of how human health and well-being is tied to ecosystem well-being, but often they have very little choice than to use nature for their livelihoods. So it's not lack of awareness, in that case it's lack of opportunity. All is not lost, however. Let me take you back to the 19th century for the second event, this time a remarkably good news story. 13 years after the Drake well gushed its oil, another event in the US heralded a most outstanding change, and Peter mentioned this. In 1872, Yellowstone National Park was established by the US Congress. It became the world's first national park. Minister Garrett also pointed out that the world's second national park was here in Australia, in Sydney. Peter, it was actually just called the National Park at the time. I'm glad that legislators decided to add more than one park. In a relatively short 138 years since Yellowstone was established, a most remarkable action by governments, Indigenous peoples and local communities has seen vast areas dedicated to long-term conservation of nature and cultural values. Protected areas are the foundation stone of biodiversity. Today, there are over 120,000 protected areas worldwide. It's about 22.8 million square kilometres, and I believe that's about 3 times the size of Australia. A very impressive 14% of the land surface is in protected areas and parks. But that's not enough. Only 1% of the world's oceans are protected. This needs to be worked on, and a great deal of work is needed to ensure protected area systems are ecologically representative, that they're well managed and able to adapt to climate change. Nevertheless, the fact that society made a choice to conserve nature and acted on this choice by putting in place this network of protected areas is cause to celebrate. You may well ask how those two 19th century events fit together and what relevance do they have to this Congress. I'll try and answer that. In the coming years, change will be a defining feature of our society. We'll face many difficult decisions and perhaps a few surprises. In spite of the gloomy picture that I painted earlier, I'm not that pessimistic. We're clever. We're capable of learning. We're capable of sharing that learning amongst ourselves and to future generations. I believe that we will find the willpower and the means to turn away from the path of unsustainability and to choose a path that aggressively addresses climate change, that stops unsustainable consumption patterns, decarbonises our world economy and develops renewable energy, a path that ensures biodiversity and ecosystem services are valued and conserved, and that the poor of the world escape poverty and hunger. This is where those two events are tied together. Both events show that from very small beginnings, large things can emerge. The growth in the numbers of protected areas over the last 130-odd years provides an example of the capacity of society to make conscious choices to conserve nature, and they are living proof that we can have a more sustainable future. Both examples show that we're adaptable and that we learn. As the concept and the management practices of protected areas has developed, so too has our understanding changed. We now see that protected areas not only conserve biodiversity, but they also provide spiritual values, recreational opportunities. They can mitigate against natural hazard. They give us a source of clean water, they store carbon, and as we are going to hear this week, they can improve human health.